Hi UW Marinette, my name's Adam Fulwiler. I'm originally from Wisconsin, but you're here with me in Fayetteville, Arkansas in my studio. I figured since I'm going to do a remote artist talk, might as well bring you into the actual studio, since that's a pretty rare opportunity for most artist talks. So I'm just going to kind of treat this pretty informally and kind of walk around the studio and talk about some of the work that's in progress in here. All the work that's on the wall currently in my studio is brand new, while the work that was sent to UW Marinette was mostly from my MFA thesis exhibition from the University of Arkansas, which I just graduated from this past spring. And I want to say thanks to Lydia for inviting me to show at UW Marinette. It was such a pleasure to have some of my work show back up in Wisconsin after it being pretty centered here in Arkansas for the last 4.5, 5 years. So let's jump into it. I'll talk about some of the ideas that my work is dealing with, whether the work here is dealing with a lot of the same ideas that the work in the show at Marinette is. So there's several things that I find really important in my practice, ideas that I've been trying to perpetuate through my work, and that have been the kind of the central focus of my thesis paper for my MFA graduation. And that is the idea of openness, liveliness, and slowness. And I'll describe a little bit more what those are, but those are all qualities that I seek in paintings that aren't my own, but that I certainly seek in paintings that I'm making in the studio. So openness I define as a painting being ambiguous, having a sense of changeability, a painting that seems, if you turn away and look the other direction, when you turn back around, the painting might look different. It might not be the same painting that it was when you first looked at it. And then liveliness is kind of this sense of energy, this sense of, it applies to openness as well, but it's a sense of changeability, the sense of, it has almost a breathability, a quality of life to the painting. And then lastly, slowness is something that has really been influencing my practice in the past 3 years, and it applies directly to the two-sided paintings that I sent to Marinette that were on the pivoting apparatuses. Those paintings were intentionally created two-sided to really engage the viewer into a process of movement to actually see the piece itself. Rather than a painting hung on the wall, the viewer can be in somewhat of a static viewing process, where the paintings that were hung with the pivoting apparatuses, they're both spinning with the air movement from a viewer passing by the piece, but also, the ambient air quality in the room also slightly starts to spin them. In my thesis, I was really intentional about hanging those paintings adjacent to or in front of other paintings that had similar colors, similar compositions, that as the paintings spun around the room, they would make certain connections with other paintings hung behind, kind of put the viewer into this sort of discovery mode. I seek to insert Easter eggs into the paintings quite often. A large body of work in the past 3 years has been focused on color, and color as almost a body, or a way to personify color, treat color as a figure, and think deeply about the relationships that colors can create, and also kind of the energy to openness that happens when you deal really strictly with color. So here's a painting that I'm pretty excited about that's in process. It's got a couple passes on it, so I'm interested in how I can take a simple structure influenced heavily by quilting, abstract quilt patterns, thinking about tenderness, thinking about the domestic as in relationship to my brother, growing up with my brother who has autism. I'm sure some of you have read my statement that was part of the show, and a lot of the work in the show has been heavily influenced by growing up with my brother who has autism and how that has changed the way that I perceive sensory input in my daily life. So all the work is really heavily influenced by kind of my changed perspective as it relates to sensory input. So these paintings were taking a simple geometric structure and then experimenting deeply with color and how color can create sensory input and sensory fluctuation. But also, I call these series the tender grid series. Soft edges, it gives these shapes kind of almost an anthropomorphic type of feeling, where certain sections, the edge slightly breaks, or it's not cleanly taped off, everything's hand painted, so there's fluctuation. Shapes start to overlay shapes, and you start to see the edge, you see the history. Again, time is starting to be present. You can see that there's a history being built up, even though the surface of this painting, which is quite far worked, quite far along, you can see that there's deep layers, but on the surface you have one flat structure. And then as you start to walk around the piece, you can see that, okay, there was actually a shape that protruded past and into this shape previously, but now it's been painted over. So there, you can see that there's almost a scarification of the surface. There's a revealed history, but it's been slightly veiled. A lot of the work on the walls in my studio right now is works on paper. I really enjoy working on paper in the studio because I find it's low stakes. I can take larger risks and figure out some solutions to problems that I may be having in larger works on canvas. So a couple of these paintings I actually worked on and created as some demonstrations when I recently taught in Peninsula School of Art this past summer. And I definitely take some inspiration from my landscape that I'm surrounded with in my daily life as well, as it relates to sensory input. So this piece in particular, I work a lot with paint skins, which are acrylic poured paint that is dried onto plastic and then peeled up and can be cut and manipulated and used as a collage material. So these were two image transfers of these kind of abstract swirl patterns that I had found on the internet, and then I transferred them to the paint skins and started the collage back around that. I work in collage quite often, both on my work on canvas and the work on paper, but generally my work on paper is pretty heavily influenced by collage, with both some canvas, paper, and then I often use the sewing machine as an extension, another mode of collage as well, which I'll show some images of my sewing machine in the video as well. The two-sided paintings that are in the show at Marinette have been sewn as a form of collage, but also as a form of building a surface. A lot of the paintings, those two-sided paintings, a lot of this pieces of canvas were painted before being sewn together, but there is some sort of manipulation that happens also after I sew them together. I think of that sewn line both as an extension of drawing, and not just a way to affix things to each other. Hence, in some of one of the larger two-sided paintings, you can see different colors of thread being thought about as a way to incorporate that stitch as mark, and not just as an attachment method. So these two larger works on paper over here incorporate a process that I developed in the last couple of years. On the floor in my studio, I'm always using plastic as a way to collect history and process. There's, whenever I'm working on paper and I'm painting to the edge, I like to have that, kind of be recorded on the plastic. Because later on, I will take these works on paper, or sometimes entire works on canvas, and I'll cover the entire thing in a matte gel medium, and then I will then stick it down onto the plastic basically making the whole sheet of paper a paint skin and pulling up all the history that has been built up on that piece of plastic in the studio. So you can see that there's like some geometry that's been picked up because of the edges of the paper being painted on top. And then there's also moments where there might have been a shape that I painted over on the plastic, and that gets peeled up as well. Even some of the dirt and detritus and pet hair and things that happen to collect on the plastic, even after I sweep it off, there's always still some unexpected surprises when I peel it up later. But the thing that I love about the plastic is, as I said, it's capturing that process in the studio, that collection of time, but it's also gathering moments and textures that are almost impossible to recreate when you're painting directly onto the paper. So if you come in here, you can see a really great example of that. As when you paint with acrylic on plastic, it kind of resists, right? Because it's a water-based material, plastic repels water. So you get these beautiful moments of paint kind of frozen in time as a liquid. So it still looks like it has that resist factor that happens when you paint on plastic, but now it's frozen into the painting. It has that sense of changeability, that openness that I talked about in the beginning of my talk here. And now it's caught in the painting forever. It creates that dichotomy. I love a lot of dichotomies in the work. I love fast, slow. I love high frequency, low frequency. A mark that looks like it's been created quickly, but it's actually something that has been built up over time. It's actually a long process. Kind of those unexpected things that can happen when you experiment with mark making potential. So these paintings are pretty far along, and you can see there's some collage that's starting to work its way in. I'm collaging on some canvas scraps and some pieces that have been sewn together and maybe cut apart. I like to recycle a lot in the studio. If a painting doesn't work out, usually I will cut it apart and start to input it into new painting or save it for later. I've got bins and bins of collage material that I like to dig through when I'm working on a painting. So I have a large cache of palette and sizes and just different options to pick from when I'm working on these paintings. Here's another painting that's coming along, and this is a paint skin here as well, but it has not only opaque paint, but also areas of transparency. So there's moments where you can see through to the layer of the painting, and it kind of creates this interesting sort of veil when collaged over the top. This green that's showing through here is actually the green that's behind it on the paper, and then the dark kind of deep green hue is on top. So it kind of starts to create a different type of space rather than using other methods that we can to create space. It's creating a literal window or passageway to a previous layer. Lately I've been experimenting a little bit with spray paint. Some of my works that were in my thesis exhibition were created entirely with spray paint, but I've loved to use it as a collage material to bring into painted surfaces that have been painted with a brush. It just creates a certain type of atmosphere and airiness that is really difficult to recreate when you're using paint from the tube or painting on with a brush. I'm really interested in the work having, shifting speed and kind of moments where a collage item doesn't seem like it's fully emulsified with the surface. You're kind of questioning whether it's working or not. This is like a moment of chaos, or it seems more like a gas rather than like a material, So you kind of create a deep space shift between the kind of flat acrylic and then this kind of atmospheric, speckly, spray painted section. Same thing with moments of pastel or moments of paint marker. This is painted, then torn tissue paper. I find that tissue paper is a really beautiful material to work with. When it's wet and you tear it, it gives a similar kind of edge quality that a swath brush stroke can bring as well. And in some of the paintings, I incorporate, objects from life as well. Like this little triangle here is a recycled piece of denim pants that I used to wear in the studio. I believe one of the two-sided paintings that's in the show at Marinette also has some recycled denim in it. I also often make my own tools in the studio. I find that's a great way to solve problems, but also create new problems in a positive way. This little piece of mat board that I cut as a stencil, I put a handle with duct tape on it so I could hold it up and paint along the edge as a way to get quick lines. This I used a lot in my painting Upside Down in the Reflecting Pool. That was in my thesis. I'll put an image up on the screen now. I created this as a way to create quick geometry, but not geometry that's too tight. That might be created when you're using tape or something like that. And it also was a nice way to smooth out edges. I kind of put it up flat against the painting and rubbed it around like that to kind of wash things out. Here's a pretty ridiculous example of a tool that I made. It's like a 4-foot long squeegee that has been made out of snowplow rubber. I made it to be able to create an edge-to-edge pull on a large canvas and create large washes of paint really quickly. I also have made some brushes in the past. I don't have any with me because they have not survived the battle. I'd buy lots and lots of chip brushes and sandwich them in between pieces of wood and screw them together. And I was able to make really large brush strokes at one time. There's a couple paintings that I can put up that have been that has been used in. During the initial lockdown during COVID, graduate students had to go home. They weren't able to work in their studios anymore. So I had to figure out a way to continue my practice at a high level, but do it at home in a small bedroom. So I started taking mixed media sketchbooks and treating them as a time-based painting. This idea was kind of what eventually led me to make the two-sided paintings later. So I have a few, these two are in progress. This one is finished. And it's not necessarily making paintings in the sketchbook to generate ideas for larger works. It's more to take these books and treat them as one time-based art piece. So I'm working through these, and they're also low stakes. That's one of the great things about having a sketchbook practice is if it doesn't work out, you don't have to show anyone, right? But these I was thinking of as being something that's finished, something that is kind of a serious endeavor. These were thought of as art books rather than a sketchbook. So there is certainly like ideas that are being generated as I'm working in here that eventually worked their way into the paintings, but they weren't being made to generate ideas for paintings, if that makes sense. So you can see I'm experimenting with some watercolor. Watercolor I find is another beautiful material that can create a different type of speed. And there's these windows that are being cut that are, again, showing layers that are 1 layer, 2 layers, sometimes even more previous or in the future. You can get a hint at what you're going to see when you turn the page. And some of them even have incorporated some of the sewn canvas pieces into the sketchbook as well. flipping through them is really one of the most interesting experiences, because similar to the two-sided paintings that rotate slowly, as you turn the page, you're revealing different chunks of the next or previous page as the page moves through space. The painting at the show is titled after Caught in Between Here and There. Was created also with spray paint and that technique I spoke about earlier, the covering the entire canvas in matte gel medium and placing it down onto my studio plastic floor and peeling up some of the history. It was kind of, the idea behind the painting was to create a sense of blurred vision or questioning whether your eyes are in focus or not. And I wanted it to be something that was also time-based. So if you spend some time with that painting in the show, there's a few sections of it that have been painted with interference colors. So colors that shift as you change position, almost like a holographic playing card or something. So yeah, in the top edge in the bottom right-hand corner, there's some red, blue, and green interference colors that as you walk by and see it at a more oblique angle, you see that there's some shininess. There's a new surface that wasn't there when you were seeing it straight on. All of the works on paper that are in the show, Caught in Between Here and There, were created in the course of about a month and a half leading up to my thesis exhibition. There was a large projection room in the gallery at University of Arkansas that I didn't want to leave empty. Since I wasn't working in video, I wanted to engage that projection space in some way. So I decided to make a massive body of works on paper to fill that room from wall to wall, all created in a pretty quick fashion. Hence the very limited palette that those paintings have. You know, I have several of the paintings that have been created with like a blue, kind of an ochre, red palette, and then the other group of paintings that have been created with that green, that blue, and kind of darker blue palette. So I limited the palette to kind of bring down my variables to create more opportunity for discovery. The texture of some of the passages in those works on paper, specifically the white that was in one of the green paintings. So those paintings were all worked on the floor, all together at once. And a lot of those moments where it seems like something has been stuck to the surface and peeled away, that's quite literally what actually happened. So I was engaging in a sort of monotype process when I was painting on those on the floor. I'd paint a large gesture, and then I'd take that painting and stamp it on top of the other one and step it down and then peel it up to create kind of a duplication of the mark on another surface. And that created a lot of those opportunities for there to have that kind of sticky peel away texture that happened in some of those green paintings and often in the other palette as well. So I'm not really one of those artists who plans a lot of things out in the sketchbook or pre-plans before diving into work. I kind of talked about it a little bit, but I use my works on paper and smaller works on canvas to generate new ideas for larger works on canvas as well. But a lot of times it's just about being in the process, being in the studio and taking chances and just pushing through those rough times that come up when you're working in a painting. But I also like to develop kind of systems of chance, systems of kind of games or certain mechanics to input into the studio. I'm a huge board gamer. I love tabletop games. So I like to try and kind of bring that love for systems and mechanics of board games into the studio in my painting practice. So I developed this sort of card game of sorts that I sometimes use when I'm feeling like I'm being a little bit too precious when it comes to the painting, and I feel like I need to take a complete, just out of the box risk. And sometimes that means trying to make something else tell me what I have to do to get away from that precious kind of mode that I've been working in, which can be really debilitating and kind of reduce the chance of a good painting, to be honest. So this deck of cards, there's several decks, and I basically tell myself I have to draw a card from each of the decks and then kind of follow the instructions that I've been given. So there's a deck of cards for several different kind of categories of painting, I guess. These are all self-defined, so take everything with a grain of salt here, but I have a deck for edge or technique, a deck for shape, pattern, size, tool or material, and then this is like size of the shape, I guess, and then transparency of the paint or material that I'm using. And then I would draw from each pile. So let's draw a hand here and see what we get. Okay, so here I got pattern, loose stripes, size, medium, large, shape, figurative, edge/technique, filled, hard edge, and paint is translucent, transparency, translucent. So I would take this defined set of parameters and bring that to the painting that I feel like I have gotten too careful with, and basically mess it up intentionally. Not that this would always necessarily mess it up. Sometimes it would generate a new idea. But it was a way to kind of get out of my head a little bit when I was in too deep into a painting and felt a little bit trapped. I could use some of these tools to generate new ideas, but still continue to keep working. The work is also pretty heavily influenced by both poetry and jazz. I'm a musician. I grew up playing trumpet and guitar and was in a band for quite a few years. But I find that music and rhythm and tempo, both as it relates to poetry as well, has tempo and rhythm, influences the paintings and the way I title my work as well. The painting that's in the show of colored verbs and adjectives shrinking from the light is from a John Ashbery poem. It's a line taken from that. But it also, poetry really relates to the work in the way that both of them take time and patience to fully experience, to fully engage with them. And same thing with music, of course, is it requires time to fully engage with. But the structure and composition of the painting of the colors and verbs shrinking from the light can see how it has a distinct kind of jazz-like tempo in how the yellow paint skins have been adhered to the surface. There's a certain rhythm that's created by the way that they're adhered, a certain pattern. So I find that those two things, painting and jazz, really influence the way that I compose and the way I bring in objects and shapes into the work. Well, thanks so much for joining me in my studio here in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And thanks again to having my work at UW Marinette. All the best.